is under the leadership of dreamers or prophets who communicate in dreams or trances with the spirit world.
Throughout the ages, these contrasting opinions have caused friction.
In the quest to figure out how exactly we ought to approach life, when it comes to the nitty-gritty, the ethical concerns, what we do, what we wear, how we think, what this all is, how this began, we have to most often turn to religion for these more base answers, these more fundamental answers. But when we start to shop around, so to speak, we start to notice that these religions aren't just commenting on cosmogonies and eschatology and theology, these deeper things. They seem to have an interest in what we wear and what we eat and how we think. For instance, why is the Bible, especially the Old Testament, interested in what foods you eat when? Why in Sikhism is it enforced that you wear a turban? Why in Hinduism and in Buddhism is vegetarianism enforced? These little facets, these little articles that religion enforces, not eating pork, so forth. What is that about? And in the many ways that we can approach the question of what is religion, we have to also then approach the question, what is culture? And from there, we can begin to ask a really intriguing and fundamental question. What is the difference between religion and culture? Are they the same? Is religion simply an import for a culture, a way of thinking? If they are different, how are they different? Where do we separate religion from cultural import? And what does religion do that culture doesn't? This is our introductory investigation for this argument and this question. Is religion simply a cultural invention? And in investigating this, what might this tell us about the nature of religion? So, there's plenty of hedging to do ahead of time here. Our mission isn't necessarily to come to a concrete answer. The investigation is like this. How can we define what a lake is if it is indeed a swamp? Where does the water begin and the land end? This is much more uncertain than we'd like it to be. And accordingly, we should approach this overall subject matter openly and let it tease out its own wisdom. So let's mostly focus on giving a little compare and contrast amidst these various traditions. For instance, this motif of religion serving as a cultural narrative. For instance, iconically in Christianity, we're talking about the story of Jesus as that occurred in that part of the world. Might this be likened to indigenous stories, for instance, the Dreamtime stories of the Aboriginals that tell how the land came to form or how the world formed from this land? Or, for instance, indigenous stories, how Devil's Tower came to look the way that it looks. These are cultural narratives. The migration of Muhammad to Medina, the vision of Zoroaster, of the greater monolithic Ahura Mazda. Adding the extra layer makes this even more confusing in a way. For instance, how does the Epic of Gilgamesh fit into this? How does Dante's Inferno or the Odyssey fit into this? Do these cultural narratives constitute culture or constitute religion? And you can see how they all play in the same proximity. They aren't necessarily distinctive in this way. Nonetheless, we can observe that religion and culture have this tendency to include cultural narrative as an import. It's not necessarily just about, again, the theology, the eschatology, and the ethics. It tells the story of a certain people. To further muddy the field here, or the pool, going with our swamp analogy, we should look to these various arts, language, and identity. The creation of certain architecture as it is evocative of a certain culture. We look to Southeast Asia. We ask, oh, is this not simply Buddhist? When in fact, this form of architecture very well predates any assimilation into Buddhism in the area. However, Buddhism becomes tied to this form of architecture, to this ancestral temple making. And the same, of course, extends out to India. When we see these various temples, are they Hindu or are they culturally ancestral to the area? Do they predate these forms of worship? Where does one begin and the other end? And of course, this goes out to the stylistic cathedrals of the Gothic or of the Renaissance. These different forms as they are cultural movements, but they relay religious import. They use religion as a means or as a flavor of cultural expression. Islam is known for its calligraphy. Where does this begin and end? Accordingly, Gregorian chants. Is this ancestral to the paganism that was there prior to any Christianization? These are earnest questions, and tracing them isn't necessarily the point, because again, where is one and where is the other, and how intertwined they truly are. So then, we should start to dig in a bit more about religion as a cultural system, just the idea that it is a cultural system. Because if we take this literally, then most people of the world are obeying cultural systems that are not their ancestry. Why are people telling the story of Israel if they've never been to Israel? As opposed to their heritage, where they come from, what is their people's story, you see? If this is the case, then we've become very messy and very lost across the world, and we've lost most of our cultural stories. But instead, religion seems to be involving a system of symbols or a system of universal truths that are unnegotiable, that transcend culture. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. If this is a set of symbols, a means of interpreting the otherwise chaotic and uncategorical ineffable world, then it doesn't necessarily matter. It's a frame, it's a form. And if we are to write something, if we are to have an opinion, if we are to do anything on this world, then we need a form for that to take. And so accordingly, these different system of symbols become necessary for this expression. And if humankind willed to unify, whether through violence or ill-gotten means, but regardless sought to unify, then to have a similar set of symbols would become necessitated. This is a very novel consideration, considering all the work that we've done in the course, all the syncretism that we've seen across the world in what is otherwise designated as peoples who were never in contact with each other. Whether we say that ancient peoples were in much greater contact than we give them credit, or we say that there's a mutual story that they all carried throughout time, isn't necessarily relevant. In that, no matter, there seems to be some degree of teasing towards each other, these cultural systems that seem to have some forms of mutual cohesion or mutual communication. As we've learned, there are innumerable instances of this. Trickster deities or trickster essences, whether that's Crow or Coyote or Loki, totemism, as it was iconic throughout the world, the inanimate objects taking on sacerdotal functions. Pointing this out, these syncretisms, these uniformities throughout these disparate religions or spiritualities across the world, it plays both sides of the argument. On one hand, these synchronicities dispel the idea of culture in that sense of that this is just something that is a silly, distinguishing, personable way of relating to the world and doesn't hold any credo when it comes to objectivity. Everything is just as true as everything else. But then, on the other hand, the fact that these syncretisms exist hints at this other objectivity, this unification, or that which is sought underneath the guise of culture, or that which is foundational and goes beyond culture. And this is where we have to acknowledge this aforementioned counter-argument, the transcendence of culture through religion. When I give scripture, for instance, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. This is not something that is cultural. It's not something that's distinguished other than by language. This is a sort of prose or a sort of wise speaking that speaks throughout humankind. It speaks to anybody. These prose statements or these wisdoms do just that. They transcend the artificial or superficial boundaries of humankind. Race, ethnicity, social, political status, these are all silly yammers in the face of what is sought, the eternal truth, so to speak. So then, if religion is an enterprise, if religion is a mission, then its function is to seek these eternal truths. And it co-opts culture, or it uses culture as a means to do so. We have to be a people, after all. And whether this truth comes from these people or comes from these people, if it is the truth, then it doesn't matter. So this would be to say that religion innately is making a philosophical statement about the metaphysical nature of the universe. And that is to say that the universe of which we find ourselves in has objective truths. And that these objective truths need to be discovered, remembered, or honored. And by that investigation, we could see how culture then might just stand in the way of this seeking of these eternal truths. After all, if I show you a shrine, and this looks like a pagan shrine, then your culture might just have you revolt, subconsciously or otherwise, about what exactly that is and what exactly they're doing. But if I show you this shrine at the church, and that's much more tame to you, then that shows a difference of culture. Not necessarily belief, not necessarily any of these things, but just a different way of culturally approaching the sacred. Now, if each of these earnest practitioners or groups of earnest practitioners are utilizing the shrine towards the same aim, seeking that which is sacred, seeking that which is the eternal truth of the universe, then what's the difference? If I show you worship in Hinduism, if I show you worship in Buddhism, if I show you worship in indigenous communities, are we to distinguish who is rightly on the path here and who isn't rightly on the path here? This is more a matter of cultural taboos and of I am greater than thou-ism. The spiritual one-upmanship, as Alan Watts liked to point out. This idea of one religion being the true religion and all the others being false, this kind of competitive mindset, is uniquely Western. In that, if we look to other traditions across the world, even Christian traditions, there's so much more syncretism. Mexico, or South America at large, is a great instance of where indigenous culture has syncretized with Catholic culture. If we look over again to Southeast Asia, this is a great instance of where the native culture assimilated with Buddhist culture. These things do not destroy each other. This is often the confusion of Westerners trying to study Eastern religions because they involve each other. This was Shintoism, this was Buddhism, this was Taoism, this is Confucianism. Where does one end and the other begin is an earnest question because they syncretize with each other. They are not seeking to annihilate each other. They complement each other. They bring different truths. And the living word or the living tradition or a culture that's living takes the bounty of these variant ideologies. So then this idea of competition or the one universal truth is, again, uniquely cultural, interestingly enough. So it's intriguing to notice here how religion breaks culture. It transcends it not only in its pursuit and its ideals, but it also changes it fundamentally. It seems to deal with culture on a foundational level that can shift its whole metaphysic, its whole philosophy and approach towards life. Religion, when introduced, can change a whole worldview for the next generation and generations to come. It can change the whole trajectory of a people's, for better or for worse, of course. The will to share, the will to express or to give, provide these universal wisdoms that have been discovered is earnest. And when this is the case, this is what transcends cultural boundaries. And this is ultimately, perhaps, a diagnosis for the modern world and how we're seeing religion decay and decay and decay. This is not simply a decay of culture, but it's a decaying of that which is sacred, or the approach of that which is sacred, the seeking of this truth, this eternal truth, or the sublime. This cultural relativism that comes with this subject, potentially, of just pointing out, yeah, religion is just cultural, and thus it's silly and superficial, that trivializes the sacred. If you go too far down the road of cultural relativism, it always leads to nihilism. And this is what's becoming of us. Because the baby we threw out with the bathwater, so to speak, was the sacred and the mystery and this earnest seeking, that which truly unified these various traditions. But on the other hand, curiously, culture can continue without religion. It doesn't necessarily need it for the creation of art or the creation of architecture or to go on. But it seems that if this is the case, then that culture continues towards this aforementioned nihilism. What it's continuing for is up for question. What is being sought by that culture? Where is it going? What's the aim? What's the mission? What are we doing? And so there we see something very distinguished here, very, very special, that in this way, the seeking of that which is sacred, or the seeking of the universal truth, or the seeking of the mystery, the wonderment of it all, was our kind of heart for going on, for humanity to continue what it was on about. This might be at least a partial truth, or at least a truth within many truths here, because we have a whole nother element to talk about, and that is religion as not a cultural import, but an ethical import, an ethical system. Because most often it's not just interested in what you wear and what you eat and these, let's just say generally, interpretably, superficial things. But notice, especially with the major religions, that they come with a moral system. This is the 10 Commandments. This is the 5 precepts in Buddhism. This is Sharia in Islam. This is the function most often, or at least historically, this was much more the function of religion, of offering up this ethical system for reasons of bettering society or bettering the cohesion of civilization. When we were peoples untouched by society, so to speak, untouched by vast population centers, we had enough community with each other that there was an unspoken understanding. There wasn't a need to assimilate various peoples under one rulership. And only when we needed to assimilate various cultures and various cultural identities together did we need to create an ethical system, or that which would inform us a kind of, whether true or not, uniform ethical way of living. This speaks differently throughout time. For instance, if we're approaching the more animistic, ancestral way, then your mythic stories inform you not only how to best live, but also wisdoms are packed into these moral stories. And this is the function of folklore. Folklore as it teaches us something. When you were told the story growing up, the question often was, and what's the moral of the story? This is storytelling. This is the function of literature in its ancestral base. That which teaches us, that which informs us how we ought to go about and what we should look out for. And often these stories of monsters and these creatures in the hills were to do something very similar. It was to keep the kids from wandering off too far, because there actually were things to look out for out there. And we want you to be better for it. So don't do that. So we'll create monster stories that give a kind of moral and ethical guidance in their effect, you see. And as time goes on, and as religion starts to function as a societal statement, you can see moral code or law becomes more relevant than these, I should say, maybe more passive stories. But these things can also inform us as to ritual practices. Often in indigenous storytelling, it is in fact showing you or telling you how exactly to go about cultivating a certain crop. And outsiders most often interpret these stories as vulgar and as literal, when in fact these stories are actually informing something medicinal or something horticultural. So then we can observe plainly that religion and storytelling functioned not only as a ethical basis, but also as a bastion of knowledge. This knowledge as it was accessible to those who understood the means by which this story is told, and that's always allegorical. We've seen throughout the course how easy it could be to misunderstand myths when you're missing some kind of cultural knowledge, or if you try to interpret these stories as literal and superficial. When in fact the story could be telling you how to cultivate corn, why certain objects are viewed as sacred. Again, why is the snake such a figure? Why is the cross sacred? It could also tell you about how the universe began, but not necessarily in a literal way, but in a way that's informing you something very secretly or very underhandedly about life and some sort of divine wisdom. Typically, in my experience, at least in all my years of study, the cosmology is not only handing over metaphysics, which of course is very significant, but they don't necessarily need to function as truth with a capital T as much as they are teaching you something. I think those that created these cosmologies, or those that furthered or refined these cosmologies, never viewed them necessarily as the whole story. They viewed them as a means to give great wisdom, great lessons, but they tend to be the most encoded and the most hard to crack, so to speak, for those that don't know the language of that culture and the language of that mythology. So then these can often come across as the most strange or the most, they provide the most room for projection into, the most unknown, and naturally so. What we might notice about religions that age as opposed to ancestral, inherited spiritual practices is that when we have our people and we have our stories and we have our community, we have just that. We have community, culture, and identity. And these things keep us honest and they keep us placed and they keep us a part of not only each other's lives, but also the world. And so then this naturally blossoms the music, the art, the architecture, the dancing. All of these ceremonies come out of that mutual creativity and that mutual cohesion. However, when there are significantly more people under assimilated society, then this is no longer storytelling purely for the purpose of our own belongingness, but now this is storytelling which is trying to take on the guise of hard and fast, unnegotiable metaphysical truth. The modern creation stories in modern religions are thus given in this way. These stories are not given or understood any longer as purely allegorical. They are understood as nothing other than unnegotiable. And that's the distinctive change. When we move away from the communal, when we move away from it being placed in our people, in our history, in our belongingness, when we strip that out, then this is all that's left. And this is reductionist, I know, but it is worthy of observation. It's worthy of noticing. The religion then functions as a moral, ethical, cultural import, modern religions that is, that tells people how to act and what reality is. It doesn't only offer up stories that offer some sort of lesson or import or pure wisdom distillation, but they are in fact coming at you in a way that tells you purely what is completely. What world you're in, why it looks the way it looks, how, why, all the answers. And in that way, you can see why the Bible then and these tremendous books, these texts, are so crucial to modern religions in that they are expansive. They touch on many different subjects. The Bible, for instance, is huge. There's so much that you can deduce from its material. And so then it seems to have a kind of opus quality where it can touch on any of these categories. And thus, there must be the answers to everything in there and nothing is left untouched. This is a very different appeal, but nonetheless, it's doing exactly what I said. It's offering this cultural, ethical, metaphysical, philosophical import that is informing you or telling you or indoctrinating you, depending, what exactly is going on here, what exactly you should do, and how you should consider any of these wayward mysteries about the world. And so in that way, the anthropological view, or what we're speaking to here, is very clear, once more, about it being a cultural import. Because if we were of the ancients, let's just say, then this would be very much up to us, regionally. What we thought of the world, where we were, its shape, what is good, what isn't good, we'd all think it out. And the elders would distill it, and it would become stories that would be passed through time and refined as minds would keep thinking it out. But instead, if we have it already pre-packaged, then we can export it. We don't need to create it. We don't need to grow it ourselves. We can export that culture, that metaphysic, that way of considering the world. So then, it's a lens and a means by which you use to inform right and wrong or approach of the phenomena of the world. So to dissect all the moving parts here, to put them apart, we have on one hand an ethical system, as it isn't necessarily distinguished from other parts, but there's that part. Then we have mythology and narrative, as it informs the ethical system, but also hides these eternal wisdoms, or our narrative as a people, or as humankind. And then there's ritual and symbolic action, whether totemism or Sunday church. This is the means by which these people, or this culture, or those who believe this religion, approach the sacred, or the symbolic. And then there's the aesthetic expression, which is mostly cultural, but utilizes the religious. It utilizes the iconography. And then lastly comes the elusive part, which is the metaphysical claims, the innate philosophy, the phenomenology, the eschatology, the theology, the ultimate reality. And these wisdoms, or these claims, are interspersed throughout these other parts, but is nonetheless distinct of itself. So, ethical system, mythology, narrative, ritual, aesthetics, metaphysics, all of this is a part of what is the religion and also what is the cultural, because it should be spoken aloud that even though a culture is devoid of religion, and as expressed previously, a culture can continue without religion, it still is making a stance on each of these subjects. It still has something to say about where humankind came from, how the universe began, what it thinks of ritual, what it thinks of sacred things, what it does with its own aesthetics and why it does that, and what metaphysical claims there are. No matter what culture you're in, there is a metaphysical basis to it. This is not something that anybody can escape. The culture that you live in is built on top of metaphysical claims. But let's make this a little more personable. When you look into the life of Christ as it's portrayed, what does that make you feel, and how do you interpret that? And when you look into the life of the Buddha, and you ask yourself, what does that make me feel, and how do I interpret this? This is ultimately what this is all about, is the individual's interpretation of what has been handed down through generations. The culture is one thing, and the individual is another. There is what is the religious, and then there is what is the spiritual. Of course, it's very convenient to group everybody of a certain faith together as though they all consider it the same way, as though they all interpret it the same way. But provided nuance, we know that these things are shifty. And we're all seeking what we think. Some of us take handfuls of how other people interpret the material, and then they just share that. And some of us want to seek for ourselves. And this is the spiritual journey, as it is your own becoming, as it is questioning what has been inherited, reacting to what has been inherited. And this is an interesting part of this conversation as well, where religion actually is antithetical to culture, or where it challenges culture. Because if the religion then is playing the part of going with the times, then that tends to be a theocracy, in that it's mirroring the modern culture. Or the modern culture is going against the values of that culture, that spirituality, and then it becomes defiant. This takes on many forms. For instance, the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship supporting civil rights during the 60s, religion and spirituality can be the catalyst of revolution then. It can be a reassertion of humanity. And it can also be co-opted by institutions of power against the interests and becoming and development of humanity. For how many stories can be shared of the burning times or the Crusades, how religion has stood in the way or abjectly destroyed the progress or maturation of humankind? Might we say, when this is the case, that this isn't religion acting in this way, but this is culture acting in this way officially, and that religion has taken a back seat to culture, and that culture is interested in power and self-preservation? Because if religion was actually religion, then it would honor those divine truths of which it touts, and it would not exercise these power moves. And so maybe that's a potential distillation or distinction for us to internalize and for us to take account of. When religion is not acting in the interest of religion, or when religion is not acting in the interest of spirituality, or these metaphysical eternal truths that are sought at the heart of these spiritual traditions. The absurdity of saying thou shalt not kill, yet pushing forward the Crusades. So then, we should ask a really intriguing question here, now that we've laid all the pieces on the board, so to speak. What is a successful religion? What is a successful spirituality? If success is thought of in the way that it is business, then that means influence is success. And in which case, Christianity arguably has been the most successful in this way when it comes to shaping civilizations, when it comes to cultural import as it's spread across the world. The Gregorian calendar, major holidays, ethical norms as they relate to sexuality, even the metaphysical basis of secular society is Christianity's influence. Its philosophical foundations, its political foundations, it's all there when you really dig. And you could also say Islam in this way arguably is competing with or is closely behind this success when it comes to influence. Now, when it comes to global reach, then, this is no question. That's why they call them the Big Four: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. This is somewhat convoluted because obviously Hinduism has a tremendous number behind it, but when it comes to how many nations and how far across the world its influence culturally has reached, it's quite novel. I know there are plenty of things that you could say about the foundations of Christianity actually being from Hinduism. I understand that there's a lot of nitpicking that you can do with just about almost everything that I've said in this entire session thus far, but I think for those who are earnest, you see my point here. If that is our definition of success as a transcultural and transnational movement, then Christianity and Islam take the cake. However, if we change the definition of success to philosophical depth, or the personal transformation of an individual's ethical basis, then Buddhism is supremely effective and thus successful. If somebody converts to Christianity or converts to Islam, then you might see that their behaviors change quite a lot. Their habits, who they talk to, who they don't talk to, so forth. But the person themselves isn't necessarily characteristically transformed. Whereas when you see the works of Buddhism and greater Hinduism at work, then you do notice a psychological change, something about the meditative practices, something about the mindfulness and the stillness that's earned. In that process of becoming, you see that the individual actually changes, benefits in some way when it comes to the cessation of their own anxieties, when it comes to their own peacefulness, when it comes to their lack of conflict. In this way, then, if the goal of religion or spirituality is in development, individuation, and maturation, then one could certainly make the case that the East is much more successful when it comes to its actual effectualness, its actual changing of the individual in a transformative way. And the endurance of these traditions as well, the fact that Hinduism is still in the conversation, shows that its success can also be defined by its adaptability and its longevity. This adaptability is particularly poignant, as I pointed out somewhat throughout this session, where the religion isn't this cold and hard stone. It has malleability. The ways of approaching divinity change. The ways of relating about divinity change. Hinduism is very malleable. There are so many variant parts, and there's a little bit for everybody. They don't throw someone out if they deny the presence of all the gods. They can still be Hindu. And in this way, it is a kind of growing curriculum, a growing lexicon of religious stories and motifs. And so in that way, you could say success in religion is longevity, and thus Hinduism, Jainism, and Judaism are actually notable contenders for the most successful religions. But one could easily throw a wrench into this and bring up all of the indigenous traditions, and their length, their continuity is truly without date. You can't say how far back this goes. And technically speaking, you could say the same about Hinduism. Anyway, we now have the expansive view, both the argument and the counter-argument. Is religion a cultural invention? And the answer is no and yes. In a very sincere way of speaking, culture would not exist without religion, since culture cannot truly exist without metaphysical foundations. The reason it goes on is at the heart of culture, and at the heart of why we're doing what we're doing. Specifically, when we get on the level of society, when we get on the level of cities and nations, and when we create religions to deal with that, then this becomes much more complicated of a subject. What is religion and what is cultural is more messy, but still somewhat distinguishable. Whereas, if we take it back to our roots, if we take it back to the indigenous and the ancestral, then religion and culture are one and the same. They function towards the same ends. You do this, you make this art in this way because of the inherited stories. You go about the hunt in this way because of these inherited stories, these mythological folk tales, these wisdoms that you've inherited from your ancestors. You can see how functionally this is completely different. Versus when we have religion to deal in the modern sense, society, then a person can have the distinction between what they do on the day-to-day life and what they believe religiously. And this can only happen in this modern sense of what religion has become to the West specifically, and the categorical nature of its becoming. We have reinvented its function. We've changed its function over time. And thus its incongruous nature, its inconsistent nature becomes apparent when we can act against the ethical structure of the given religion, yet still claim to be a part of that given religion. When, it should be said, historically speaking, this was never the case. You would go fully in on the discipline that was touted by this imported religious structure. You would honor that imported religious structure in all of its tenets, and you would honor all of its rules. This is much more apparent in the Eastern religions than it is in the Western religions, where in the West, there tends to be always this incongruous nature. And in the East, when religion is practiced, it is practiced most often in earnest, in line with the tenets of which it's giving. With regards to Western history especially, at some point religion stopped being the driver of culture, and culture began to be the driver of religion. And in the modern age, this shedding of the sacred has been almost continuously shaved away at. The sacred, at least in its stereotypical presentation, is most often interpreted as silly. These ceremonies have forgotten the reason behind their own function. They lack the very substance that was supposed to be there in the first place, the very purpose of its becoming, of its happening. The transformation of individuals in earnest, in their internal phenomena. The actual transformation and maturation and initiation of an individual into the greater mysteries of the universe. This is its initial intent, its initial function, is that you as an individual are transformed by it, and that it introduces you to the objective, greater questions of the universe. And this transformation of yourself ought to be measurable or discernible by others. This isn't something that is purely, let's just say, ceremonious or for appearances. The real sauce of this seems to have been most often lost. Ritual becomes habitual. It becomes routine. It doesn't have that pang that maybe it once had or maybe it ought to. So to answer the initiating question a bit more straightforward, the answer is it's very complicated. And it's a question of when. When culture is more religion, and when religion has been more culture, and when there is no meaningful difference between the two is a question of era. We've gotten a kind of eagle view of all of this. We've looked over the surface of all of these miasmic waters of the functions of culture and religion, but we haven't touched on the foundational questions that these different traditions are bringing to the table. What are these questions, and what are the answers that humankind have come up with? This is entirely another subject.
I can see that mankind will never be truly civilized until all races become one in spirit, understanding, brotherly love. It's all so easy. Yet men are making it so hard.
The Spiritual Studies course is an effort towards free public education on matters of spirituality, religion, comparative mythology, and the humanities at large. If you appreciate this session, it's in thanks to those who have supported the course in the Buy Me Coffee link in the description box below. This is not a profit for me. Any help with the course is to help recoup costs that I have put into making this course actively and publicly, freely available. So any support is earnestly appreciated. If you benefited from this session, it's in thanks to those who have supported the course. So thank you, sincerely. If you can't support in that way, there is a free Discord in the description box below as well. stir up some conversation. You are not alone in your fascination for these subjects. With all of that said, stay curious and keep wondering.